Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of Talking Teaching with Criminologists with me, John Shute, from the University of Manchester. This week, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. JWarr, Associate Professor of Criminology at the Faculty of Social Science in the University of Nottingham. Welcome, Jason.
Welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm honoured to be here.
Oh, it's great. It's great to have you. At the time of recording, it's only recently been announced that you won the Radzinovitz Prize for the top article in the British Journal of Crim. So many congratulations on that. But I expect you were pleased with that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, it came out of nowhere. I didn't even know I'd been nominated. So it was all of a sudden I got an announcement, and I've been trying to be that line between very humble and also immensely proud at the same time. So
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not sure I'm striking that balance because have told absolutely everyone. So, even including family members who have no idea what it means at all. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean? So,
yeah. Wonderful. Well, it's a great achievement and a great piece of work as well. This episode is about sensory criminology, which of course you've been pioneering and employing in your research. And I guess in that piece of research that was the basis of the article as well, for some years now. But you wrote a blog recently on the sensory criminology blogging site about your experiences of putting on a new unit in sensory criminology. So, it with a view of the concentration appropriately on this pod of pedagogy, then it'd be really interesting to get into that and what the
yeah.
students did of it and what you made of it later. But first, before we get there, let's hear a bit more about you. Can you tell us something about your journey into teaching, its relationship with your research interests, that kind of thing, and what you value about teaching? If you've got any sort of ideas or principles that you hold dear when you deliver it.
Well, yeah. So I suppose the thing is obviously and I've spoken and written about this in the past. Obviously I spent a number of years in prison and was released in 2004 and on parole in 2004, and then went to the London School of Economics to do my undergraduate degree in philosophy and philosophy, logic, and scientific method. And then I went from there to do my MPhil at Cambridge in terms of criminological research. And then I did my PhD at Cambridge as well, although my PhD took 10 years. Took a number of years before I could get that done. But I think really much of my kind of understanding of good teaching and good learning had been shaped by a number of teachers who I'd encountered in prison. I think, firstly Yvonne, who I met in when I was in Swinfen Hall, and then Bill, the famous Bill, who I met in Gartree, and then Alan Smith, who wrote the philosophy blog for the Guardian in Wellingborough, and really they had shaped the manner in which I kind of still approach teaching and to this day, and it was very, very discursive. It was very supportive. It was very, not necessarily task oriented, but it was really about getting people to talk through their thinking as a mechanism of building their confidence, really,
Yeah.
and building their confidence towards their own pedagogical skills. And I think, having seen some very good teaching and then some very bad teaching, and I'm not going to name names in higher education, I think, when I first started teaching at the University of Lincoln, my teaching mentor was a person called Jan Gordon, who again was an astoundingly good classroom teacher. She was so immaculate in not just her preparation and in what she was trying to achieve in the classroom, but also was very, very good at reading students
Mm,
and reading student needs in the
mm.
classroom directly in front of her. Because it's the same with all teaching. I can't think what's the famous Mike Tyson quote. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? You know what I mean? And I think that's the same true with teaching, right? you always have your idea of how a classroom's going to run, and all of a
mm,
sudden you walk in there and someone goes, "Sorry, I didn't understand X," and that's your whole plan out the window, because actually, what you're then engaged in is trying to just potentially bridge the gaps that the students had that you
yeah,
hadn't perceived previously, or had some assumptions around. So I think, lots of my teaching approach has been shaped by those kind of people that I've learned from along the way.
mm,
Um, and I think, as I say in that blog post, we over assess children
mm,
first and then students as they come into higher learning. And I think one of the things that we are beginning to see now, and I think this has been evident over the last 4 or 5 years, but the pandemic, I think, has really compounded this, is that students have been assessed. I think, I can't remember the exact figure, but I think someone was telling me that by the time a student comes to us at 18, they have spent a decade of being assessed every 6 to 8 weeks.
mm, mm,
And the problem is with children, they don't perceive assessments as judgments on their skill, they see them as judgments on themselves.
mm,
Do you know what I mean? And what that
mm,
happens is it's not that their skills are being compounded and
mm,
scaffolded through their learning. What's
mm,
happening is their fear of being judged is being compounded and
mm,
scaffolded through their learning. So I think one of the things that we find is that when we get students in the classroom, a lot of our early work is not about teaching them things per se, but is about doing that confidence work in terms of their
yes,
pedagogy.
yes,
And I wrote an article with Ross Little where we talked about kind of pedagogical capital,
mm,
and this is the skills and learning that you have that you can bring into that kind
mm,
of exchange in a classroom.
yeah,
And I think that's why I like that kind of discursive kind of learning, is because it is about that exchange.
mm,
It is about that kind of the sharing of ideas. As I come into a classroom as a teacher, obviously I'm shaping the discussion that takes place, but I don't presume that I know everything that's going to take place in that classroom.
mm,
And actually, I want my classes to be free enough that we can explore ideas
mm,
either beyond the texts that I've assigned for that week, or in terms of bringing everyone up so that,
mm,
if there are gaps in knowledge. Because I think one of the things that, being an old git, what I mean, that is that we tend to impose assumptions on people about what it is that they know, because
mm,
we think that they know what we know, but
yeah,
we
yeah,
don't. And actually, given that, the way that our education system is, there can be huge gaps in students' knowledge
mm,
base that we think is there but isn't necessarily there. So actually, a lot of that kind of early work in classrooms is about getting everyone up to the same level
mm, yeah.
so that you can build on that. But actually that building is a collaborative process. So
I mean, I mean, there's so much that you've said there that makes a great deal of sense, and that I support. I'm just wondering, how do you get, how do you build this sort of relational, discursive interaction and that sort of connection in a class above a certain number of students? I mean, is that something that you feel that you can do in a, say, the classic sort of banked lecture theatre, which kind of drives me crazy, I think, in terms of the limitations of it. I mean,
yeah,
can you do it?
I think you can. I think, but you need both. I think you need
Mm.
both the lecture and the seminar,
Yeah.
because I think, in that kind of didactic banked lecture theatre kind of process, where actually what you're doing is, talking at students.
Mm.
I think one of the things that you can do in that regard is, because actually, lecturers can seem quite intimidating.
Mm.
We seem to know all the answers, we seem to know all the material, and we seem to be these quite scary kind of individuals who are stood at the front of the classroom. But actually, I think in a lecture, you can do quite a lot to break that didactic barrier by presenting things and making sure that you're doing a constant check-in.
Mm.
So one of the things that I constantly do is when I'm presenting, the moment I see any student go, I'm immediately going to stop and go, does that make sense to everyone? Does everyone
Mm.
got any questions? Does anyone, and actually, by doing that, what I'm beginning to do is erode that didactic
Mm.
lecturer barrier, but I'm also beginning to humanize myself
Mm.
for the students
Yeah, yeah.
because I want my students to see me as someone who is approachable.
Mm.
And then what I can do is when we get in the seminars, and then what I typically do in a seminar is, I will try and I'm not a big fan of flipped classrooms. And part of the reasons for that is I don't flipped classrooms are dependent on A, students being comfortable in their knowledge, and B, being confident in leading conversations.
Mm.
And I find that certainly if you're introducing students to new material, actually that can erode both of those elements. Do you know what I mean? So actually, flipped classrooms can actually become counterproductive in that
Yeah, yeah.
regard. So what I tend to do is in my seminars, what I'll do is I'll split students up into small groups of two to begin with, and then what I'll do is I'll come round the room and speak to them on a two. So there's always two of them and one of me. Do you
Right.
know what I mean? So
Yeah,
that
yeah.
they don't feel like ganged up on us, as it
Yeah,
were.
yeah, yeah.
And then I'll do that and then bring everyone back together so that
Right.
there's a broader discussion. And then, like, after a week or so, I might then make it three students. And then I might make it four students in a group. And then I might do that. So, actually, what you're doing is building up their confidence each week to talk within the smaller groups
Yes.
that then allows a bigger classroom discussion to occur. But you can't go into that cold.
Mm.
You know
Yeah,
what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
You need to start some of that process in the lectures by
Mm.
making this approachable. And I
Yeah, yeah.
know, look at this boat. It's not the most approachable boat in the world, right? Do you know what I
No.
mean? But do you know what I mean? But you know, so I start to break that down,
Mm.
and so that when I get into the seminars, that I'm approachable at any point. And actually, and I make it a point. Every time a student says to me, "I have something," this might be a stupid question. I'm like, "There's no such thing as a stupid question.
Mm-hmm.
Ask." You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? And like if you have questions, doesn't matter what it's about, ask. If
Mm-hmm.
it's about the material, if it's about something the material is based on, if it's a word that you don't understand, ask.
Mm-hmm.
This is because if you don't understand, there's going to be others in the classroom that don't
Yeah,
understand.
yeah.
Let's get through that. Let's get over that. So, part of what I do is trying to, and I use that lecture seminar format to do both of those things
Mm.
because it
Right.
allows me to separate the tasks, as it
Yeah,
were, a
yeah.
little bit.
Yeah, yeah. And then I guess the benefit of this approach is that you can hopefully see over the length of the course, the confidence in the students build,
Yeah, absolutely.
confidence, and the confidence in the classroom will also equate, you would hope, to confidence with the material, and it is a learning sort of amplifier, as it were, type thing, or a way into
Yeah,
learning something. Yeah.
yeah. And I think that one of the things and it happens very quickly, actually, the moment a student posits very tentatively either a suggestion or an idea, the moment that that is not shot down, either by me or by anyone else in the room, because I won't part with that either. But
Mm.
what that allows them to do is the next time they're going to be a bit more confident, and the
Yeah.
next time they're going to be a bit more confident. But so's everyone else because they see that someone else's ideas have been allowed to run
Mm.
and get explored. Not,
Mm.
even if someone's got a reading wrong, and it's like, well, let's look at that. What made you get to
Mm.
those ideas? How does that work? Do you think that that fits in here? And it allows their thinking then to develop into
Mm.
oh no, I think I've got that wrong. Yeah, you know,
Right.
and this, that, the other. And doing that, because I think one of the things about a seminar room is and a lecture theatre is that, these are what you've got is these are not individuals in a space. These are individuals in a communal space.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And the moment that you can make that space communal and you can get them
Yeah.
thinking about the space as a communal space,
Yeah.
actually what it does is it breaks down that fear of I will be judged as an individual because actually no, the discussion
Yeah.
is communal. And
Yeah.
that's how we learn. And I think it's really about trying to get across that that's how not only does science work, science is a dialogue. You
Hmm.
know what I mean? It's just a dialogue that often takes place between people over time,
Yeah,
who are not actually in the same room together.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah,
the more that you can get students into that headspace, the more it allows them to build confidence, the more it allows them to express their ideas, which makes it easier for them to actually challenge their own thinking
yeah, yeah.
in terms of the discussions that they have with others, and then allows them to develop questioning and those kind of the critical kind of skills that we want them to. So.
Mhm. Fantastic. I mean, and we get a really good sense then of how you like to run your classes and the sort of principles behind it. Um, Great stuff. I mean, let's move on then to how you would employ that in this new unit or recently
Mm.
you teaching for a few years, perhaps I don't know, but the blog article I read recently, uh, describe this recently conceived unit, sensory criminology, which just looks tremendous. I think I've read some of your work, and I know that you're interested in opening up our research in the field to more than just words, and to be thinking about it in a multisensorial sort of way. So I guess bringing that into the classroom and seeing what students make of it is just a fascinating thing. So could you say something about sensory criminology, as a as a concept or a field for you, or a methodology, and then how you started to bring that into the classroom and develop a unit around it?
Yeah, cool. So, I mean, just to give you some kind of historical context, because there may still be some people who listen who have not yet come across that kind of sensory criminology and stuff. So, really, this started about 10 years ago, with sort of 9, 10 years ago, with the work of Kate Herity, who had started looking at um sound and other sensory kind of components of prison spaces and the manner in which that was work, and she'd started presenting on these kind of ideas around 9 years ago. And what you do, and for those that don't know, Kate Herity is my partner. So me and Kate Herity, we've been discussing these ideas quite a lot for a number of years. And then what you started to get was, so we did a panel at the European Society of Criminology conference in Sarajevo in 2018 called the Central Prison. And what it was, there was three of us. There was Kate Herity, there was Bethany Schmidt, and myself, who had looked at various aspects of prisons from differing kind of sensory kind of perspectives. And it was off the back of that kind of presentation at, Sarajevo that we were encouraged by a number of scholars, Yvonne Jukes, Fergus McNeil, and the commissioning editor Emerald at the time, who was Jules Willan, who was like, I really want you to write this up as a book. This needs to be a book. And actually, that conversation in the pub that night ended up with lots of people going, actually, I'd be quite interested in writing something on that. I've got some material on that. So that kind of snowballed into the book that became Sensory Panalities. And what it was simultaneously at the same time as that, KO, because at the time none of us had our PhDs,
No.
and that was the thing. So we were all kind of near PhD, but I mean, none of us had our PhDs at that time. So we were developing these kind of ideas, and simultaneous to that, Kate Herity decided to launch a blog that would accompany the release of the book, that would allow the conversations in the book to continue.
Mm.
Because this is not the last word. This was like, hey, here's some ideas. What do people think about it? And we allowed that blog to then kind of develop and explore those ideas. Simultaneous to that, you had scholars like Nigel South and Bill McClanahan, who Essex, who were then also beginning to look at the manner in which sound and other sensory components impacted in terms of how we understand kind of environmental issues
Mm.
and criminology. So all of a sudden, what you've got is these kind of emergent kind of concerns with the sensory as it relates to our discipline, but from slightly different perspectives. But of course, in terms of the kind of social sciences, this is not new. Anthropology have been looking at the sensory for decades,
Mm.
and increasingly in sociology and and human geography, there have been these explorations of the sensory because, of course, we are physical creatures. We exist in a world that both communicates information at us through sensory outputs, but
Mm.
we also communicate sensory outputs outwards, right?
Mm.
We have both interior and exterior senses that allow us to interpret information from the world. So, because of that, what we've got is kind of two branches in terms of sensory criminology. There is a kind of phenomenological side of sensory criminology, which is really about the individual's kind of experience of the sensory world. But we've also got a kind of symbolic interactionist element of sensory criminology, which is about understanding the kind of the symbols, the information, the ethia, the kind of structural and political ideas that are enmeshed within kind of sensory components in the
Mm.
criminological world. For us, we're much more on the kind of symbolic interactionist side of sensory criminology. But when it comes to the teaching of the module, I do cover both.
Yeah.
And because I'm arguing that essentially you can't really understand the phenomenological elements of it without understanding the symbolic interactionist elements of it. So, for instance, if you hear a police siren, for instance, you know what I mean? Now, a police siren, only the siren sounds is communicating a particular idea or
Mm.
sets of ideas to everyone.
Mm.
But the manner in which they experience those sounds kind of depends on where you are, who you are, what
Mm.
you've been up to,
Yeah, yeah,
or not up to,
yeah.
depending on that. So actually there's a great deal of context that needs to go into understanding the individual's experience. But inherent to the sound of a police siren
Mm.
is the power of the state,
Mm.
is the warning that comes with that, the idea of emergency and rush and those types of ideas are also packaged into those sounds.
Mm.
So, in terms of kind of trying to develop a module around sensory criminology, what I needed to be able to do was develop not only sufficient readings that would allow students to understand that those levels of complexity as they exist, but also these kind of real kind of ontological and epistemological and methodological positions that allow us to get at
Yeah.
those ideas. I mean, this is why it's pitched really at a third year
Mm.
kind of level, because I think trying to do it, you could probably introduce some of the ideas earlier on, but you need students to have gone through a number of kind of research methodologies at least,
Yeah.
in order to understand, you know, if you have a sound, let's take the jingling of keys, right? For instance. Now, out in the community may not mean anything, but if someone's been in prison or
Mm.
works in prison, then
Yes.
the jingling of keys, even in the community, is going to have meaning.
Yes.
Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
therefore, what you've got is the sound, may have its own the manner in which we understand the sound as a reverberation against the ear may have an ontological position, but the epistemological one is different depending on where the individual or the context in which that sound is being experienced,
Mm.
and the kind of subjective status of the listener.
Mm.
But how we get at that requires differing methodological
Mm.
kind of techniques.
Mm.
So in order to kind of run this module, you do need students to have had some understanding of
Yeah.
those kind of background ideas. So that's why I pitched it as a third year module.
And would you describe it as a research methods module, or is it broader than that, more than that?
It's a little bit broader than that. So the way that we designed it, and I kind of designed it in collaboration with some of my colleagues here. So it comes in the autumn term in the students' third year, but it also precedes their dissertations to some
Mm.
degree.
Mm.
So what it is as they are going through the kind of precursors of how to do a research proposal, what the different types of research are for their dissertation. Simultaneously, we're going through some of those ideas in
Yeah.
my module in terms of how we might look at, particular senses and what they may mean in terms of in criminological terms. So, there is that complement between what they're doing in my module and what they're doing in another module, which are both building on stuff that they would have done in their first and second years.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And do you see, or have you seen an uptake of or an extension of the learning in the sensory criminology and taken into the dissertation then? So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and vice versa, But absolutely. So there was a number of so one of the things that I did in terms of the module is so there's kind of three core elements. One is about understanding the phenomenology and this symbolic interactionism. The second is kind of understanding the sensory emotion and context link. So you hear you experience a sensory event that triggers an emotion, but what that emotion is, and therefore how you interpret the sensory, is dependent upon context, right? So just to give you an example, and this is one that I use in the blog, is that so for women walking home of a nighttime, the sound of footsteps can have very, very different emotional consequences depending on the context in which it's happening. So if they hear heavy, rushed footsteps that are coming towards them, that may evoke fear, right? But if they hear those steps running away from them, then the emotion may be different, even though it's the same sound. Do you know what I mean? Whereas the difference between a heavy tread or the click clack of heels, and the different kind of information that is being communicated by either of those sets can impact on the emotion and the sense and the experience of the sensory event. So that's the kind of second element. But the third element was really about thick description. And this was about, how do you communicate a sensory experience to someone who's not having that experience?
Yes.
Using language, which is often quite flattening. It doesn't have the immediacy of a sensory kind of experience, but nor does it have the, when you write around a sensory experience, you can only write about individual elements of it discreetly. Whereas, of course, when we have a sensory experience, like if you eat something sharp, actually the smell, the taste, nociception, the those other kind of receptive sensory receptors that are communicating different kind of information occur simultaneously, but we can't do that in writing. You have to make it discrete. You have to go, it was sharp, it was sour, it made me go, ugh. You know what I mean? You have to separate them out. So one of the techniques of this was trying to get students to understand the nature of thick description, that kind of Goethean communication of things that the reader cannot experience, in order to try and explain the sensory experience and therefore what the emotions attached to it are, and then how do we analyze those things. And I did that specifically to try and get students back into the habit of writing creatively, but also about thinking about their reader, not just a marker, but a reader, and actually what it is that they're trying to communicate to someone who has not had the experience that they had. And I found that those kind of elements, that element of rich description, I think did start to filter into some of the dissertations that we're seeing this year.
Right. Well, that's fascinating. I mean, I've been receptive to your and Kate's work for a long time. I mean, I came to it a kind of surprising. Well, my receptivity was through a sort of surprising thing that I did. I mean, this was years ago before I had kids and I had the money, time, and energy to do daft things like this. But I went to sort of like the equivalent of like a wine tasting, but for scent, perfumes type thing.
Yeah.
And you're trying to describe the smell of the perfume through different senses. So in terms of taste, is this sweet or is it a sour taste? Or if it were a sensation, a haptic one, would it be prickly or silky, or if
Yeah.
it was a sound, sorry, not music, would it be a sort of a mellow sort of middle C, or would it be sort of a discordant sort of thing? So and that really opened up my eyes in terms of thinking about fieldwork and ethnographic fieldwork as well. Along with encountering your work. And so in class, for example, I run a mass violence sort of atrocity crime unit, and I talk about some of the fieldwork I did when I worked on a project which is about how societies come to terms with a legacy of mass violence through their relationship with the dead. So when I did the fieldwork, I spent quite a bit of time in forensic labs, or with forensic archaeologists and at gravesites and things like that. And one thing was like the smell of old bones and earth type thing, which is very redolent. You use it sort of in the field associatively because it triggers so many memories. But when you're talking to somebody, holding an interview, or your focus is elsewhere in the field, then it's all around you all the time. It's almost like a haunting type thing. The dead are there, sort of everywhere type thing. And it feels though sometimes you can get the taste of it in the back of your mouth type thing.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing. But also when I went to sort of public ceremonies, commemorative events, and you record the sound, then there's sort of a backdrop of hum, of everyday conversation. And then, but the difference between an appreciative clap when people are, say, receptive to the message of a speaker, as opposed to the sense of a collective outrage, the quality of that type thing, is quite something. So I found this just very important to capture in the field and in the research per se. And I can talk about it and try and get students to think about it, imagine it in the class, in that sort of thick description way you're talking about. But what exercises do you give them to in the course to get them to get the course type thing? Because presumably they come into it thinking, what's this about? This is quite different to things I've done. How do you make them get them? What do you make them do or have them do in the class?
So the very, very first thing that I do, so we have the first lecture, and then in the very first seminar, what I do is I basically cut up a lemon, slices of lemon. And then what I did is, I obviously checked to make sure no one was allergic to lemons. And then what I did is I gave them all a piece of lemon. And I said, individually, what I want you to do is eat the lemon and then describe the sensation in as much detail as you can. But you cannot use the words bitter, sharp, or sour. Right? And I was like, you cannot use those words. And then just spend a couple of minutes just writing down what you think. And it's incredibly difficult. I mean, if you try it yourself, you can't because the immediate thing that you want to go is that it's sharp or that it's sour or this, that, the other. So the minute you have to start thinking around that, two things immediately happen. One, what you get is students trying to think of other words that are either synonymous with sharp, bitter, and sour. But typically what happens is they start talking about the emotion of eating the lemon. So what I do is, and then once everyone's done that, I get them to read out what it is that they've written down. And what you'll find is that most people there will be overlaps and commonalities between what people have said. So what that allows us to do is to understand the idea that eating the lemon is both subjective because you're having the experience. But when you see that everyone else has written very similar things to you, that there is actually an overlap and there's a communality to that experience. So that was just the first way that I would get them over that kind of, that kind of epistemic gap. Would just be that type of experience. But other ones I would do so what I want you to do is I'll open the windows in the seminar room. I just want you to tell me what you can hear and get them to list down in a group, but get them to list down every single thing that they can hear. And then get them to tell me what it is that they could hear and what pertinence are the things that they could hear are to what's going on, right? So that would be another exercise in terms of, but then I'd get them to do things like, this is a classroom. What makes this a classroom? Are there sensory components about what you can see, what you can hear, what you can touch, what you can smell? So, the smell of the blackboard marker, the
mm,
click of a clock somewhere,
mm,
the
mm,
the rooms, the voices that are coming from next door that sound like a lecture going on.
mm,
All of these things all of a sudden combine to make the students understand what's going on in the space.
mm,
I then got them to do like imaginary work, thought experiments, where I would ask them to think about an event when they have smelt something that they did not like.
mm,
So what was the worst thing that you've ever smelled? What was that smell? Where did it occur? What was the context?
mm,
Was there something about the context that makes it an unpleasant smell? What happens if you think about that smell now?
mm,
And then get them to, so there was all sorts of different things, like when we did the session on time, for instance, getting them to think about why is it in a lecture hall, the clock is often behind the students?
mm, mm,
Why?
mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because if they can see the clock, it changes the manner in which they experience time in that space,
Mm,
right? So, but whoever's designed the lecture theatre and put the clock at the back so the
mm,
lecturer can see it, but that the audience can't, has clearly thought about
yeah,
that chronoception, that
sure.
experience of time
Mm,
as it might occur in that space.
yeah,
So even if we're not as criminologists thinking about this,
mm,
someone who's designed that space has.
mm,
Or if they've put the clock at the front, really hasn't thought about how students
mm,
are experiencing time in a
mm.
lecture theatre. Do you know what I mean? So,
Yeah,
it was getting them to think about the spaces that we're in, the context that we're in, and a lot of that was in the first half of the module. The second half of the module was really, some of that thinking that we've developed in the first half. How does this then relate to criminological theory?
mm, okay.
So for instance, one of the examples, and it's one of the chapters, so Vicky, Professor Vicky Canning now, who wrote a chapter for sensory penalities about the experience of refugee women in a particular Scandinavian country's immigration detention center, where the immigration detention center is based right next door to a military testing ground. And I got the students to think about that. What does that say about a hostile environment
Mm,
when you're putting people who have fled war zones in a safe and secure space that is exposing them to the sounds of war?
yeah, sure. Yeah,
Do you know what I mean? And it's like,
unbelievable.
on the one hand, and this is what the students would come back with. On the one hand, if the people in authority know that, then that says something really quite horrific about what they're doing
Yeah,
as part of their hostile environment.
yeah,
But if they don't know what that's doing, that also says something quite horrific
yeah.
about what they're doing in terms of that hostile environment. So what I could then start to do is pick up on literature, criminological literature, and start to weave into it sensory components.
Mm,
So, for instance, if you take routine activity theory, which is, a very basic and very simple kind of criminological theory, but is long-standing and there's various elements of, corroborative and falsifying or falsifying kind of data in terms of that. But I'm like, does guardianship have sensory components to it, or does the absence of guardianship have
mm,
sensory components?
mm,
If you don't hear the whir of a camera, if
mm,
there's no barking dogs, if
mm.
there's no, um, you know, ring ding dong bell, what I mean, or whatever it
Yeah, yeah.
happens to be, how do we think about that? How do we think about light and dark in terms of alleyways, for
Mm,
instance?
mm,
And what if the alleyway is dark of a night time? What types of behaviors may occur there?
yeah, yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And it's
Yeah.
then starting to get them to think about moving from just purely the sensory in the first half of the module to the manner in which the sensory operates
Mm,
spatially, and therefore,
mm,
how that may relate to criminological theory.
mm,
So, for instance, there's quite a lot of literature on terms of how people use smell and around homelessness. Do you know what I mean? So, all the
mm,
people that are houseless, not homeless, sorry, that's a bad term, but people who are houseless and living on the streets,
mm,
and the manner in which people use, because they can't wash and their clothes
mm,
rot, and
mm.
the manner in which people use smell as a means of marginalization.
Yeah. Yeah,
Actually, we can start to revisit issues around labeling theory and smell. Do you know what
cool.
I mean? And all of a
Yeah,
sudden,
yeah,
you could start going back to some of the canon
yeah, yeah.
and thinking through how the sensory relates to that.
So it's clear then, going from what you said before, that it is much more than a research methods module. Then it's a sort
Yeah,
of a way into sort of a criminological theory and big ideas as well.
yeah,
So fantastic. Well, I mean, it's clear that there's, from your perspective, there's a lot of room for creativity in terms of tasks. How do you how do you go about assessing this? Is there also room for a lot of creativity there?
yeah. So for this, but it was an elective module, so it sits in a it's a 20-point module. So, and I have 2 points of assessment. So the first assessment is it's a 1,500 word assessment, and it counts for 40% of the module. But so the assessment is divided into two. So the first element is they have to write 500 words of thick description,
Mm,
which is around a sensory event. It's nothing to do with criminology. I make them pick just a sensory
mm,
experience that they've had, describe it in as much detail as they possibly can, and then analyze that in terms of what are sensory descriptors, what are emotional descriptors, and which are contextual descriptors, and what the relationship between each of those things are doing in
mm,
terms of communicating the ideas to the reader.
mm.
Do you know what I mean? So it's
Yeah.
and part of that is the analysis doesn't really matter, but it's about turning an experience into data which can then be analyzed. That's the idea. That was the first bit. But in terms of that, I got such a wealth of different experiences. So a number of my female identifying students um, used walking home of a nighttime, and the kind of or walking through parks
Mm,
specifically of a nighttime, and the very kind of sensory experience of that. Someone else wrote about their morning cup of coffee, but also how coffee plays a role in their interactions.
mm.
Like how she was saying that like no one in our house speaks until the coffee's drunk. Do you know what I mean? And but then there's issues around homemaking and family making and interrelations around the way that the coffee exists. Someone else wrote really richly about being tapped on the shoulder in a nightclub.
Mm,
And it was about, and what they wrote was just, they're dancing, they're drinking, they're with their friends, and all of a sudden just had a tap on their shoulder. And they don't know who it was. They don't know whether it was a friend or who, but how that simple tap on the shoulder changed their nighttime experience
mm.
because it went from a position of revelry to one of suspicion
Yeah, yeah,
and fear.
sure.
Even though they weren't assaulted in any way, it was just a tap on the shoulder,
Mm.
but it changed the manner of which they experienced
Yeah,
their
yeah.
nighttime experience. So I had a real kind of, you know, uh, um, uh, range of kind of sensory experiences in that first one. One of them was just another one, for instance, was on her very first driving lesson, having someone behind her beep
Mm, mm,
when
mm,
she was just her very first lesson, and the
mm,
manner in which that caused panic and fear and
mm,
and uncertainty and embarrassment and blah blah blah, and those types of things. So that was the first assessment. The second assessment was what I asked them to do is move away from the kind of more phenomenological elements of this to explore a space.
mm,
Now they could either do that as a thought experiment or to pick a kind of a space on campus and just explore that in the imaginary. So
mm.
how would you go about? And they had to divide this up into kind of an introduction, literature review, quasi methods,
Mm.
discussions, findings, conclusions. So actually, the modelling of the second assessment reflects what they'll be doing in the dissertation.
Yeah,
Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
So, but then it was about, they had to identify a space, describe that space in as much sensory detail as possible, but then think about it in terms of criminological ideas.
yeah. Mm,
So, for instance, one student wrote about her, and I discussed this in the blog, her front door, and she used it as an idea of as a portal.
mm,
So, and a portal has a particular rhythm. So, actually, she then started using Lefebvre's idea of rhythm analysis
mm,
to discuss whether or not what was a polyrhythmic use of that door, i.e., the family coming in home from work, the kind of normal processes and routines that you would get, versus an arrhythmic, i.e., someone trying to break into the house. Do you
Yes.
know what I mean? And
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
so all of a sudden you've got the blending of routine activity theory with Lefebvre's rhythm analysis,
Mm,
in terms of sensory criminology.
mm,
Another one who I didn't write this in the blog, but she wrote about how um uh sorry, I'm not going to give that example. That's but another one of my oh, sorry, I'll just flick to another example. But
yeah, sure.
another one of my students wrote quite profoundly about um the visitor center outside of prison,
Mm,
um in terms of going to visit a family member.
mm,
And what she was talking about was the manner in which this space, even though it's just a building that's not attached to the prison, it's actually over the road from a prison, still has the kind of penological elements that you would expect. It's still got bars on its windows, even though it's not in the prison. And,
yeah.
they're not trying to keep anyone into it. And, and she kind of looked at this space and examined how the prison was reflected in this kind of visiting space, and
Mm,
what that means in terms of how ideas of kind of eligibility and less eligibility are
mm,
imposed upon others. Do you know
mm,
what I mean? So all of a sudden you've got some of those ideas. Um, Someone else chose a shop, and the
mm,
manner in which um, the movements in and out of a shop can actually contribute to theft,
mm,
because actually it mitigates attention of the people who work in the shop, which actually then creates blind spots,
mm,
which then means that their product's more vulnerable. So
mm,
even if they put mirrors up, even if they put situational control measures in place, the
mm,
actual movements in and around the shop itself
mm,
creates distractions,
mm.
which then means that that guardianship is not happening, for instance. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So there was all
yeah, yeah,
sorts of,
yeah.
yeah.
That sounds fascinating, and to the extent that it can be sort of a joy to mark. And I think when you create a new elective, I mean, there's joys and satisfactions to be had at any level of teaching, introductory teaching and so on. But you always want your elective to work, don't you? Because you put a lot of yourself into it, and a lot of
Yeah, 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 yeah.
your energy and your research interest as well. So how did the students receive it then? I mean, I don't mean sort of crude course evaluation questionnaires
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
senses, but clearly you got some really good work. What did the students make of it then? Did you feel as though they all got it and that they
Yeah,
took this on
I think to
and
some degree, yes, and some degree, no. I mean, I think so. I told the students very early on, this is the first time this module has run at this university. And in fact, this is the first time that any such module has kind of run in England and Wales. So,
yeah,
that actually some of this we're going to be developing together, and I said to my students very early on, I want and need your feedback. If there is something that I am not getting or something that I am not doing, I need you to tell me so that we can correct that very quickly in terms of the module, but also that I can then improve the next iteration of this. So, one of the things that, for instance, that came up very, very quickly, almost in the second and third seminars, was um, can you explain the methods more succinctly? So, what I'd been doing is kind of presenting, this is what the sensory is, this is what it does, this is how we think about these things. And actually, what the students, and this was my assumption, was that the students would get the qualitative kind of work would allow you to get at some of these ideas, but they couldn't see the link.
mm,
So, literally, across all three of my seminar groups, they came back at me and went, we need more detail on the method and
mm,
how people have actually done this work. So all of a sudden, what I started doing was building into the seminars of just a few minutes of kind of, right, well, how, what did the person say about their methodology? Right. And they said, well, they interviewed people. Right. Okay. Well, let's think about that. What benefit is interviewing people about smells,
mm,
smellscapes? for instance. Why do you have to interview someone in order to get at how they experience the smells in a particular urban environment?
Mm.
Why? And then all of a sudden you can have that discussion around, well, actually, if there is this sensory emotion context issue going on, the only manner in which you can get to that is the interpretation that the individual has.
Mm.
Well, if we're looking at interpretive kind of interpretations, how do we get at that interpretation? Well, the only way to do that is to ask them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
all of a sudden we could get through to those things. But I'd assumed that the students would get that. They very quickly told me that no, they needed that pointing out. The moment I could point that out, it allowed the discussions to move much more quickly
Right.
in terms of the kind of abstract and the theoretical ideas.
Mm.
But also one of the things that I think was beneficial for students, and they told me this was quite a lot, when I'd said about the difference between the thump of a shoe or the click clack of a shoe in the nighttime kind of walk home, students could immediately associate that to their everyday life.
Mm.
When we spoke about, hearing a siren, if you're on your walk to uni and you hear a siren, you know what I mean? If you're woken up in the middle of the night and the
Mm.
siren's outside your house, very different kind of context.
Yeah.
They could get that immediately because they'd all experienced it.
Mm.
And it's so there were discrete elements to this that they could go, I've experienced that, which would then allow them to think through what the meaning of that thing was.
Yeah.
So lots of my students told me that it was the first time that they'd been able to take quite abstract ideas and apply them directly to their own experiences
Yeah.
in their own social lives or in their own realities.
Mm.
And I think that was quite useful. And I think the sensory allowed that because it's something that we have, it's the manner in which we make sense of the world around us, but we're
Mm.
just not taught to think about it.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But the moment you go, well, what is it you can hear? Well, what's that hearing doing to the way that you're existing now?
Mm.
They like to, oh, well, I can hear someone crying, or I
Mm.
can hear kids laughing,
Mm.
or I can hear birds chirping, or I can hear sirens, or I can hear, whatever. All of a sudden, it allows them to go, well, my experience, our experience, and the sensory environment.
Mm.
The moment I got over that hurdle, the rest was fairly easy.
Great, great. Well, that's marvelous. I mean, it, it sounds as though you use sort of like formative feedback to sort of improve the course of
Absolutely.
action going on, which is really
Yeah.
valuable, I think, as opposed to just
But it's also continual, I
yeah,
think, you know what
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Yeah, it
Iterative.
had to be.
Yeah, great. But it also be sometimes I think it'd be interesting to have like longer term sort of evaluations of how people think about the um their learning in a particular unit further down the line,
Yeah.
months, years even. I mean, it's not unusual, for example, for our students, or, not all students to enjoy their stats classes, but at the time. But then when we get alumni coming back saying, well, actually, that was really useful, made me think in different ways, type thing, and it had sort of lasting impact. And I say that particularly about your work in this unit, in the sense that once I started to open myself up personally in my research to using different senses, it sort of changed the way that I sort of experienced lots of environments, just in everyday life, really. And I mean, clearly, if you're sort of rushing to work or whatever, then you don't often have time to appreciate the environment. But I know I can't be bored in an environment now, type thing. If you think
Yeah,
about
yeah, yeah.
how you experience it and so forth. And it also, I do it. It's sort of a mindful thing to do as well, type thing. If you're sort of present in the moment, thinking about the different ways of experiencing a space, for example.
Mm.
So I wonder if students take away some of the lessons or the thoughts, and employ them, in their broader life, later on.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think I've had uh, one student is now working with in Sen with children. So it's actually thinking,
Oh.
and like, thinking about the sensory environment as it relates to children who are, either on the autistic spectrum or with children who are dyspraxic
Mm.
or neurodivergent,
Yeah.
and the manner in which that they now experience, even something like having a scratchy label in clothing can be, if you oh, I've forgotten the term, but if you're hypersensitive
Yeah. Yeah.
to physical stimuli, even just something like labels in clothing can be extremely torturous
Mm.
to some individuals, and if there's I can't remember the author now off the top of my head because I'm terrible with names, but he talks about soundscapes and says that we don't have any earlids. Do you
Mm.
know what I mean? It's very difficult to
Yeah.
curate
Yeah.
or to mitigate the sound environment because we can't, unless we literally do that.
Yeah.
We can't block it out.
Yeah.
And if you are suffering, for instance, with PTSD, we know that sounds can be incredibly triggering
Mm.
for people with PTSD, especially if they've come from spaces of conflict. But also if they've had histories of other types of trauma, you
Mm.
know. Interestingly enough, if you read Kate Herity's book, Sound Order and Survival in Prison, um, one of the little kind of anecdote stories that she has is where someone was like, um, he was a prisoner who had to tell a prison officer, "You're going to have to stop wearing that fragrance." And the prison officer was like, "Why? It's just whatever the fragrance was." And he was like, "That's the fragrance that my abuser used to wear.
Mm. Yeah.
And I can't, every time I smell it, I'm thrown
Yeah.
back and I'm not going to be
Yeah.
responsible for my actions." And as Kate points out, that officer never wore that fragrance in that prison again.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because there was an immediate understanding of that
Yeah.
trigger element of that. And actually, so in terms of students going on and working in, prisons, probation, policing, etc. I think some of these ideas will carry on. So we know that in terms of policing, so cognitive interviewing of victims often gets them, rather than to think about the memories as they exist in kind of any linear format, what you try and do is you get the interviewee to think about the sensory components in experiences so that they can really focus really narrowly
Mm.
on a sensory component rather than the totality of what
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all of a sudden they can think about the color of the shirt or the fragrance that the individual was wearing, or and it allows them then to build up an image
Mm.
of
Yeah.
what happened much more slowly than going in what happened,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden they're faced with that kind of traumatic flashback.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in terms of cognitive interviewing, these are manners in which you're using the sensory to mitigate the trauma of recollection.
Yeah. Sure.
So that can exist, and but also thinking about the environment in prisons when and I think there's all sorts of ways in which people who have left the course could now think about those environments. I know
Yeah.
that student who works with Sen is absolutely thinking about those things, but
Mm.
I've also got a student who has gone on and started volunteering with a victims charity, and has started thinking about, and they've told me, they messaged me to tell me that they've started thinking about the spaces in which victims are being brought into, which are really kind of institutionally designed spaces, and the manner in which what that might be doing
Mm.
in terms of either unhelpful kind of environment or, but it's like, would never have thought that before doing
Yes.
the module.
Sure. Fantastic. Well, thanks so much. I really could talk about this all day and listen to you all day, but we've run out of time, I'm afraid.
But,
So
oh, cool. Yeah, I
thanks.
told you I'd rabbit, you know what I mean?
No, rabbiting's perfect. I love it. But we'll certainly put a link to the blog. I mean, many congratulations again on the article that we started in the prize for that bit on producing this fascinating looking unit. And good luck with it in the future because I'm sure it's going to become a firm favourite with students. So thanks very much, Jason, and we'll see you again.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
And thank you for having me.
pleasure. Bye bye.
See you later.